After a perfunctory first practice in Mexico, given really to many of the young drivers who replaced the big names, a few exceptions, but generally speaking, the track was also very dusty and dirty in that first session. The action really began in the afternoon in the second session. They went out on mediums initially. Like Austin, Pirelli here have the medium and the soft pretty closely matched and quite a big gap to the hard, so we barely saw the hard being run at all today. And of course, for many of the drivers, there were not that many laps to bed the car in on mediums because they hadn't driven in the first session, and then it was straight onto the soft. So let's have a look and see how it panned out when they did that. Max Verstappen did one lap, 17.3, and it was comprehensively quicker than anyone else. He wasn't that happy with the car. There were still some question marks about traction, front flap they were still playing with, but normal stuff on a Friday. And don't forget, of course, that the track was still evolving at this point. Charles Leclerc was very quick. He was one of the drivers that did run like Oscar Piastri in the first session. Charles Leclerc 17.5 for Ferrari, showing that Ferrari are going to be very competitive this weekend. We'll have a look in a minute at the top speeds as well. Kimi Antonelli also ran this morning, 17.5. Very good job for Mercedes. Lando Norris out a little bit later than the others on the soft tyre. The track was probably a little bit quicker at that point. Didn't get in a great lap, but 17.6. Lewis Hamilton similarly out a little bit later, 17.6. George Russell, 17.8. Yuki Tsunoda, 17.8, going quite well again. Fernando Alonso, 17.9, kind of under the radar. Carlos Sainz, 17.9. A little bit annoyed, no doubt, to see that they have indeed changed the angle of the curb at turn 2, about which we spoke with Mark Slade, one of the key elements of Carlos's performances in Mexico over the last few years, and of course that brilliant win last year for Ferrari. He's really good over the curbs at turn 2. Does something there that not many other drivers can match. Anyway, the trucks were out on Thursday changing that curb. They won't say exactly how, and it wasn't listed in any of the notes from the race director, but that curb is now different. So probably some of Carlos's advantage has been taken away. For what reason? Who knows? Lance Stroll 17.9 in the other Aston, Liam Lawson 18.2, and then Oscar Piastri again looking a little bit lackluster in the other McLaren, even though he did run on Friday morning in the first session, 18.2. So at that point you'd say, wow, Max Verstappen looking really good out of the box in the Red Bull, and indeed he is, no doubt about that. But how is it going to pan out when they started to put fuel in the car? I've got representatives there of the 4 top teams, and look at the number of laps Max Verstappen did. After he did that quick time on the soft tyre, he came straight in, put fuel in the car, and he was the first out on mediums to start that long run. That's how he managed to get in so many laps. Everybody else a little bit behind the 8 ball, set by Max. Yet again, Max and Red Bull, got to say. And you can see there on his medium, bearing in mind at this point, of course, at the beginning of the run, he's probably running more fuel than any of the others. You have to take that into account. But Lando Norris looking very, very good alongside Max on the medium tyre there. Lando 21.4, 21.2, ending on a 22.3 before he did a couple of slow laps, and then right at the end a 21.0 on the medium, which kind of took everybody's breath away. Max at that point, the only driver apart from George Russell to do so, but he got in a better run right at the end. Max with George, the only one to run the medium and the soft in direct comparison. So that's another very good bit of homework by Red Bull. But on the medium, very consistent around the mid 22s, but nothing like as quick as Lando, which would suggest, as I say, a difference in fuel. But by the end, with Max having done more laps, you have to say they're about commensurate with fuel, and Max coming in for a used set of softs that he'd run earlier, of course, 21.1, 21.0, Lando Norris on the medium. So it's going to be close between those two. Charles Leclerc, very consistent as well. Got to bear in mind, again, probably not running quite as much fuel as Red Bull, but very good runs by Charles Leclerc. But going off quite dramatically, typical Ferrari being a little bit harder on their tyres. Look, those last 3 or 4 laps on the Ferrari going away. And George Russell in the Mercedes. Kimi Antonelli pretty near him on everything he did. George right at the end doing a 21.3 on the soft tyre. That's about representative, 2 or 3 tenths away from Red Bull all day. But again, a reasonably good run on the medium tyre. So classic George, classic Mercedes. Expect them to be there when the race proper gets underway. But also bear in mind the track is going to pick up a lot of grip tomorrow. No rain at this stage predicted. And then finally, let's have a look at the top speeds on the soft runs. Critical in Mexico, of course. It's a very long straight, 1.2 kilometers, just under a mile. That has a big bearing on the lap time, obviously. But again, we have the pattern of those who are super quick on the straight, not necessarily following that through with a lap time. The other factors in Mexico, it's a circuit very high in altitude, 2,200 meters, so the cars generate much less downforce than normal. On top of that, curbs are really important. Brakes, tyres get very hot, particularly with the medium and the soft being so close to one another. A lot of the teams, particularly Red Bull, appearing with more louvers on the car, Red Bull and Ferrari, to get a lot more cooling for the brakes and to some extent the engine. Interestingly, McLaren making no real changes in the cooling area on their car. But let's have a look at the top speeds. Williams, Mercedes, 358 in a straight line. It's pretty impressive, isn't it? 358 kilometers an hour from Alex Albon. Charles Leclerc just behind that, 355. Now, I said when we were looking at the soft tyre runs that bear in mind how quick the Ferraris are in a straight line. They do therefore have, seemingly on this Friday at least, a pretty good race package. Quick around the lap and also a straight line speed advantage, which is no mean thing around Mexico. Nico Hülkenberg in the Sauber Ferrari, 355. Lewis in the other Ferrari, 351. Maybe running more wing, not quite as quick as Charles today, but still looking pretty good when he's in the car, quite balanced and doing the usual Lewis thing, turning a little bit later than we're used to seeing him prior to 22, but looking pretty good and confident and comfortable in the car. Kimi Antonelli also very good, 349. Fernando Alonso 349 in the Aston. That's a bit of a surprise to see Aston that quick in a straight line. Fernando will be pleased about that. George Russell 348 in the other Merc. Yuki Tsunoda 348, and look where Max Verstappen is, 346, down with Lando Norris 344. But the two quickest drivers in terms of the fuel run, and to some extent Lando, give or take some laps when he had a bit of a misfire out of the pits, very quick on the soft tyre, but both of them relatively slow in a straight line, which suggests of course that they are generating a lot of downforce on those cars and it's serving them well for the rest of the lap. Oscar Piastri a little bit quicker, again suggesting maybe he's running slightly less wing and maybe we'll see some changes to that tomorrow. Also, you'd have to expect that maybe Red Bull will take some wing out of the car, some front flap or whatever they can do to get more top speed, because they do look to have a pretty good car around the lap as a whole. Other than that, a relatively straightforward day. It was really just that afternoon 1 hour session that brought everything back into focus again for this amazing World Championship, as it is right now, with Max Verstappen still very much in the running, mathematically at least, in the Drivers' Championship, trying to put together yet another perfect weekend. It's almost as difficult as knowing why you're quick in Formula One, trying to put a perfect weekend together without really thinking about it and just going about it in the normal way is a very difficult thing to do. But so far, it looks as if Red Bull are doing that. McLaren look to be about where they've been recently, with Oscar Piastri not looking that impressive so far. Lando Norris looking by far the sharper and more polished of the two drivers. It is early days though. We'll see how it progresses over the weekend. And I guess the big news is that Ferrari are back in the frame again, at least up there with Mercedes, and potentially challenging for somewhere near the front of the grid. Although, as we said in the chat with Mark Slade, and indeed in the live stream, in the build-up to this, being on the front row, being on the pole in Mexico isn't necessarily a massive advantage, not as it is at other circuits, because it's such a long run down into the first corner, and even without DRS, you can get a tow, and you are a bit of a sitting duck on the pole. But anyway, that's a long way away. Well, it's 24 hours away, and I don't think anyone tomorrow will be driving not to be on the pole if they can possibly be there. Anyway, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Big crowd in Mexico, great atmosphere, and in that stadium section, that's unique in Formula One, that really. They tried to create that in Miami, but it works really well in Mexico. But this circuit has a lot of heritage, a lot of history as well, named after the two brothers, Ricardo and Pedro Rodriguez. And you can see there behind me, a replica of Pedro Rodriguez' helmet, courtesy of my friend Diego Moreno. Thank you for that, Diego. Anyway, we'll see you tomorrow. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to REC Watches. Take care. After free practice on Saturday morning in Mexico, I spoke to Mark Slade, the championship-winning race engineer who's worked at McLaren, Mercedes, Renault, and more recently, Haas Ferrari. Very quick lap from Lando Norris right at the end there, out on softs. That's kind of changed the face of everything that we saw yesterday. But let's just get your take, first of all, on what we saw in the bulk of the session. Only Max Verstappen seemed to do any sort of long run with fuel in the car.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a response to him appearing to be somewhat slower than Lando Norris yesterday in P2. So obviously he thought he needed to do a bit more running on high fuel. I thought that was a little bit odd, though, because looking at it yesterday, it just seemed that Max was just taking a lot easier on the tyres in the heavy fuel yesterday. So it almost looked like he had almost no degradation at all on his heavy fuel run on the medium, whereas Lando was pushing quite a lot harder on the soft and had some degradation. And also Charles Leclerc was pushing very hard at the start of his run on the medium and had quite a lot of degradation. And so a bit surprised that they felt that they've actually got a problem. So obviously he's not feeling great in the car, and they decided to do something about it. But the other thing that's a bit odd is that yesterday Max was very, very good in the slow speed corners. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, and also in the stadium section, 13, 14, 15. Whereas today, the only sector he was super quick in was sector 2. So it's kind of an inverse, which is a bit odd. But yesterday he looked phenomenal in 4 and 5 in particular.
Yeah, he did. And I mean, right at the end there, yesterday, Lando did that 21.0, which I suppose freaked them out a bit on the medium tyre. But as you say, the run yesterday wasn't at all bad, and it was relatively consistent compared with, say, Ferrari.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you look at his run today, it was an 8-lap run. It was quite a long run too. I mean, they obviously put a lot of thought into doing that today, and maybe that distracted from what they were doing on the soft right at the end. I mean, I don't know if that's the case. Would that be possible as well?
It is something that you do when you're not happy with what you've done on Friday, and it's something that we have done before with different drivers. Nico particularly used to want to do it in Haas the last couple of years, but it does detract because you spend a lot of time sort of just filling the car up and just changing your settings on the steering wheel potentially, and the driver has to get into a different mindset, and it can be a little bit damaging to the process of just getting fully hooked up for qualifying. But again, it's Max, so you wouldn't think that would be too much of a problem. But he just generally didn't seem that much as together with the car today as he had done yesterday on low fuel. So it is a bit of a puzzle, I have to say. I'm just wondering if he's going to get to qualifying, change his mindset, and it's all going to come back together again. But if they did do something to the car overnight because of the heavy fuel running that they genuinely thought wasn't good enough, they might want to be undoing that right now and getting the car back to where it was yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, they went to a lot of trouble to do 3 quick laps on those soft tyres, doing a quick lap, then 2 slow, and then right at the end they did 1 slow. It's almost as if they're preparing for a qualifying session where there's going to be a lot of laps and you need to stay out there on the soft and make sure you get enough out of it on 3 quick laps.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, the tyres do get very hot, and so you're going to need to do either 2 slow laps on track, or you're going to want to come through the pit lane, possibly even stop in the box and wait for 20, 30, 40, even up to a minute to let the cools down before you go back out again. In Q1, whether you do multiple laps in Q2 and Q3 is another matter, because obviously those sessions are a lot shorter.
Yeah.
You don't have as much time to do that. But it still looks like the tyres are best on the first lap if you get the fronts ready for turn 1 on the outlap, which we saw a few people struggle with on the mediums at the start of this P3 session. A few people going straight on at either turn 1 or turn 4.
Yeah. Turn one, Carlos Sainz, a big turn one.
Yeah,
Just on the subject of Carlos Sainz, what do you think of that little sort of vertical
yeah, they've
buffer
moved.
they've got on the apex of turn two now?
Yeah, it's almost like they've tried to foil him, haven't they? Because they've
Yeah.
moved that bollard into where he was putting his tyre, but no one else was. So it's a bit of a shame for Carlos, I think. Because actually, yesterday,
it's difficult to imagine what the thinking is there, unless, I don't know, unless all the other teams have said it's not fair, he's much
well,
better than us, or maybe they're all doing a lot of damage there in trying to do that, and this is a sort of compromise of, but they don't really
maybe.
care about the teams getting underfloor damage, do they?
We didn't. I don't remember cars getting damaged there in the past. It was just that Carlos was better at being more precise. But I think what the only problem is that there might be a lot of focus on track limits, people getting chucked out for track limits at turn two. If it stayed where it was, and maybe they're just keen for that not to upset the flow of qualifying, so they've moved it in so that track limits just isn't an issue with people trying to do that. But I do think it's a bit of a shame for Carlos, because that was definitely something he was good at. I did think yesterday he looked pretty strong in the slow speed. I think he really he likes this track. He goes very well here, and I think the Williams just was holding him back a little bit. I don't think he was quick enough to be sort of front two rows, but I do think he's looking like he could get into Q3 if he gets his lap together. But he and Albon both screwed up their last runs, didn't they, on the soft at the end of the session, so they didn't get the times in.
So Lando Norris 16.6,
Yeah.
Oscar Piastri 17.2.
It's not looking good for Oscar.
It's getting worse.
Yeah, he didn't look good yesterday, and he's not looking good today. It's just not happening for him, is it? Something's not quite right there.
I mean, you suggested when we spoke last time there's maybe something going on with the anti-dive that they've changed on the car, but had enough time to get used to it now.
Well, that's the thing. It's as far as I know, he's had that most of the year, hasn't he? So it's not a recent change, but it is something that apparently is different to Lando's car, and I can see that it might help Lando, but he was quick earlier in the year relative to Lando with the same difference in car setup. So it's a bit odd, and I don't think it counts for that big difference in lap time. There's no way it's that much. So he just seems to be struggling just to get the car rotated in the low speed, generally speaking.
Yeah. And when it is a car as good as a 16.6 car, which is obviously efficient downforce, grip, balance, all the rest of it, actually 0.6 of a second is even more of a gap than it is if it's a bad car, really.
Yeah. It's really huge. But on the other hand, Max was similarly slow today.
Yeah.
So everybody else went 6 or 7 tenths quicker than yesterday. Max only went 2 tenths quicker. Oscar was slow yesterday and is the same offset to Lando today, roughly. So he has gone quicker, but Max is the only one who's actually not picked up the lap time you'd expect. So yeah, it's very puzzling, to be honest. Very puzzling.
Mercedes back into the frame more than they were in Austin, as you predicted, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite an interesting battle between Ferrari and Mercedes brewing.
Yeah, and I don't think it's impossible that George Russell could put something in, cat amongst pigeons. I think pole position isn't impossible. And I actually thought Lewis was looking really strong. Looking at his laps yesterday, I think there's potential for a very good lap time, possibly more so even than Charles Leclerc. So Lewis was one of the closest to Max yesterday in those slow speed corners. George and Kimi Antonelli, actually, I think he's looking pretty sharp as well. So it is looking like a very tight battle for the front, maybe not for pole, because Lando was looking so fast today, but the other positions in the top 5, I think there's a lot of variation, and it's going to come down to just getting that lap absolutely nailed.
Lando Norris gave ample warning of how quick he and the McLaren-Mercedes would be around Mexico in FP3. And we've done a separate video there, Mark Slade's analysis. Fascinating as ever, and Lando didn't disappoint under pressure. His goal going into the last phase of Q3, a lap definitely under 1:16. Charles Leclerc had become the first driver this weekend to break the 1:16 barrier with a brilliant 15.9 in the first phase of Q3. Lando P2 at that point, knew he had to do something like a 15.6, 15.7 to be near the pole, and he ended up doing a 15.5. Just brilliant by Lando Norris, to the point where you think, where has he been in so many races this year? And where has the McLaren been, more to the point? Because the car was just superb around Mexico. A perfect compromise car in the thin air in terms of top speed, low speed grip, turn-in, traction, and then high-speed change of direction as well. Just a joy to watch that McLaren around Mexico. We'll get on to Oscar Piastri in a second, because he was not in the same class as Lando yet again. Have to underline that as well. Ferrari, very, very good around Mexico as well, as we suggested in the build-up to this race, in the conversations with Mark. Ferrari, very, very good. Of course, they won this race last year with Carlos Sainz. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, almost identical in lap times. Lewis right there, very, very good through the high-speed change of direction, sector 2. Charles, very good as well in all three sectors, but they couldn't beat Lando. And no surprise there, the McLaren-Mercedes does have the most efficient aero package. George Russell in there as well, just behind the two Ferraris. And Max Verstappen, only P5 for Red Bull Honda. He was fastest yesterday. It looked pretty good for him, but there were some telltale signs in the longer runs when they're on the medium tyre. Max went to the soft tyre right at the end of his medium run yesterday as well on fuel. And at that point, when we looked at the times that Lando Norris was doing on his soft tyre run, I thought, well, maybe they're just running a lot more fuel. Max did a longer run, and that was my supposition based on how good the Red Bull has been recently. But no, it was not that. The Red Bull, and this is only my opinion, in the very thin air of Mexico, it's 2,200 meters high, remember, that thin air is a very, very strong acid test of aero efficiency. It's not just top speed against downforce. It's around the overall package of the car. And if you are on the limit in terms of aero and what you're doing, and you're not quite there, it's going to show up in thin air. And against that, of course, you'd say, well, the Ferrari hasn't been the most aerodynamically efficient car this year. The Red Bull, certainly since Zandvoort, has been better than a Ferrari. Well, the answer to that is that they're quicker in a straight line than the McLarens, and a little bit quicker in a straight line than the Red Bulls and the Mercedes. So they're making up for it, but they're not losing anything by supposedly running a little bit less wing for that top speed. So Ferrari, for whatever reason, do have a great car in the thin air of Mexico, whereas Red Bull in the thin air of Mexico are suddenly back almost to where they were before Zandvoort. All those revisions they've made, all those improvements with the floor. Yes, there's an issue here as well in terms of the tyres getting hot and cooling and brakes, engine cooling as well. And Red Bull particularly had a lot of improvements coming to this race, but then so did Ferrari in terms of outlets. But Red Bull's overall aero package just not up to the job today. It seemed as if Max Verstappen could get the car pretty good in Sector 1, which is a bit Mickey Mouse, lots of curbs, change of direction over the curbs, but then he would suffer in Sector 2. Or he'd be not bad in Sector 3, but then he'd be useless again in Sector 2 and not brilliant in Sector 1. He could never get a compromise for all three sectors. And it's been a while since we've seen Max in that situation. And I suppose looking back now, just to put a full stop at the end of the Max analysis, perhaps this shows even more the job that Max has been doing in the last 4 or 5 races, because quite clearly he didn't win with the best car. The best car still was the McLaren in terms of overall aero efficiency, which brings me back to the point, where was Lando all that time? Where was Oscar Piastri as well? So Max Verstappen starting only 5th, big problem for him now, because if it's one-on-one in Mexico, yeah, with a natural toe, you can do a lot of overtaking. But if you're in some sort of DRS train, you're just going to be locked in position. So a very, very difficult race for Max now. And probably in terms of the championship, it now looks very, very difficult. Just in 1.5 sessions, back end of yesterday and then today, all the hopes are that we would have some sort of dramatic Drivers' World Championship climax against the two McLaren drivers have kind of not disappeared, but faded very, very significantly as a result of what happened today. The big shock for me actually is Oscar Piastri and why he wasn't super quick today around Mexico. He's had enough races now where he's been off the boil to come to Mexico, as I say, not that demanding in terms of really difficult corners. They're going to sort out the difference between Lando and Oscar. And to be blown away again by a massive amount again. I mean, the better the car, the margin becomes more and more significant over which you've been beaten. And we saw today Oscar Piastri just out of his depth compared with Lando Norris. Actually, you have to go back to Baku, the race where Mark Webber, his manager, said, well, he's only human, you know. The implication of that is that you make the odd mistake, but then you recover from it and you become superhuman again. So he had that bad race in Baku. But Singapore, he did okay in qualifying. He was there or thereabouts. The problem was what happened in the first corner. And ever since then, Oscar has been... It's almost as if he's like, well, if that's the way you want it, forget it. I'm not that interested. That's what it looks like. I'm sure that's not the case because he's Oscar Piastri. He's an Australian racing driver. He wants to win above all. But to be blown away here by the likes of Kimi Antonelli and Carlos Sainz. Okay, admittedly, Carlos has got that ridiculous 5-place grid penalty as a result of his thing with Antonelli in the US Grand Prix, which moves him up a place. But to be beaten by them in qualifying, Oscar Piastri in a McLaren, it's just absolutely shocking. I can't think of any other word to describe it. And I have no explanation for it. I wish I had. At one point in qualifying, Oscar was talking about the PU had seemed to misfire a little bit, but they didn't seem that concerned about it. It's okay, we'll fix that sort of thing. And the car sounded good on the onboards. It looked okay, but he was just blown away by Lando Norris, not in the same class. And the way we saw it going today, he does not have any hope of beating Lando to the World Championship now, the way it's going, if it continues like this. So Max Verstappen very much in the background at the moment going into the race. Oscar Piastri even more in the background going into the race. And Lando Norris, the guy who's lying second in the championship on an unbelievable pole position. Behind him, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. There's going to be a lot of crowding going down to that first corner for sure. And the Ferraris will be near one another. Lewis will be wanting to beat Charles. Lewis will be thinking today, I did a great lap. And Charles just went a little bit quicker. Amazing lap by both of them. Amazing laps, really. Amazing recovery by Ferrari. And I suppose in a final perspective, you could say also something that I've been saying from the start of the year, which is that most teams are going to have their day in 2025. One team's going to get more or less right every race, and that's McLaren, quite obviously. But some weeks it's going to be Ferrari, then it's going to be Mercedes, then it's going to be Red Bull. Red Bull have done a very good job of consistency over the last few races. But here, it's Ferrari. For whatever reason, and I have no explanation for it as either, other than that they are quite quick on the straight. The Ferraris, very, very good around Mexico. They did a great job today. Very good. So it's Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, very good again in the Mercedes. That'll be annoying for Red Bull and Max as well to be starting behind George Russell. Very difficult for him to get past George unless he does it off the line, of course. Kimi Antonelli, good job. Considering that's the one driver that you would have thought would suffer a bit from those high-speed change of direction S's, and so it was. I think that was the difference between Kimi and George Russell today around Mexico, just the high-speed stuff. But everywhere else, Kimi Antonelli, beautifully detailed, lovely to watch. Carlos Sainz, fabulous lap as well. Such a shame he's got that penalty. Oscar Piastri, P8, 16.1, very disappointing. Isaac Hadjar right there again, 16.2 in the Racing Bulls. Excellent job by Isaac Hadjar. And Liam Lawson had the car, again, made mistakes. Wide turn in, braking as late as he can, ran wide at the chicane, lost the lap, so didn't get out of Q2. And Oliver Bearman, the other driver to make it through into Q3. Haven't said enough about him this weekend, but he's looked really good in the Haas Ferrari. Congratulations to Oliver. Another excellent performance from him. Like a couple of the others, he didn't have enough softs to be able to do 2 runs, so he just had to go out on a scrub set on the first run and then second run in Q3, obviously on the new set. Fernando Alonso kind of ran out of tyres as well, did a reasonable job in the Aston Martin, very good job in the Aston Martin, but couldn't get out of Q2 either. Used up all his softs yesterday and this morning trying to get the car to work. And so there we are. Lando Norris on an unbelievable pole. Congratulations to him. This is probably the best pole he's ever got. Probably the best lap he's ever driven, I would think. Under pressure. Immense pressure from Charles Leclerc, who did that 15.9. And there was Lando, went out to do a 15.5. Incredible. And as a final thing, let's just have a look at the difference between Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. Bear in mind how good Max has been in the last few races. From sector to sector. Sector 1, Max was 0.13 slower than Lando. Sector 2, he was 0.21 slower than Lando. And Sector 3, he was 0.13 slower than Lando. On the overall lap, 0.48, nearly half a second slower than Lando Norris around Mexico. And it's not that long a lap either. Half a second between the McLaren and the Red Bull. That shows how good the McLaren has been. And where have they been in recent races? Please advise. And Oscar Piastri, please advise. And I think it also shows the job Max has been doing, as I say, in a car that quite patently, as I've been saying, doesn't have the same aero efficiency as the McLaren. And it showed up today in the thin air of Mexico. Anyway, we'll see what happens tomorrow. They said, I think it was Laura Mecky's got on the radio to Max after qualifying and said, great job, Max. You did the best we could today. It's a long race tomorrow. My memories of Mexico, it's actually not a very long race. It seems to be over in a flash. And if you don't get it right, there's very little chance of recovery. Anyway, we'll see. Maybe it will be a long race. Maybe we'll see what happens tomorrow in that big drag race down to the first corner. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja and REC Watches. See you tomorrow. What a motor race. Well, Lando Norris dominated the Mexican Grand Prix, dominated it from the pole, drove beautifully. And wasn't it nice to see some great drives? Lando Norris, obviously, and Oliver Bearman, just superb in the Haas Ferrari. We'll get onto that a little bit further into the show. But yeah, Lando Norris dominated the Mexican Grand Prix. And on paper, that would have added up to a relatively boring race, probably because there wouldn't have been much overtaking behind. Lando out front. From lap 11 onwards, yeah, Lando, you can pull away. And that's exactly what he did. All credit to McLaren-Mercedes for getting the car as good as it was, and for Lando for driving as well as he did. But it wasn't a boring race by any means. There was so much going on behind. It was a great Grand Prix. In many respects, it was one of the best races we've seen for a long time. My only reservation in saying that is that it's one of those circuits where there's so much runoff area that inevitably you can go off and you don't damage the car, and there will be lots of issues about track limits, about regulations on how to rejoin, when to rejoin, things like that. And it makes you think, wow, circuits like Baku where none of that comes into play, bring them back. But that's the only thing. Apart from that, Mexico this year, just absolutely stunning in the television it produced, really, and for the show, for the fans there. So let's go through it. It won't necessarily be in chronological order because A, it's very late on a Sunday night, and B, it's too difficult to do that in the time frame we have. I'm just going to go through some of the incidents that I think added up to the results that we saw at the end. It all started with that run down to turn one, and that's what I was saying yesterday in the qualifying video. Being on the pole isn't necessarily a huge advantage in Mexico because although there's no DRS obviously in play in that early lap, on that first lap, there is nonetheless a big opportunity to get a natural toe. And that's what we saw as they came into the braking area. And the guy that was benefiting most from all of that, really, was Max Verstappen on medium tyres. Everybody else around him on soft tyres. This was a great call, I felt, by Red Bull, contrary to the one they made in Singapore when it was the other way around. This was a great call. They didn't have much to lose, that was for sure. But remember also that Max was the only driver that did a full tank run in FP3 on Saturday, and was the only driver to run both the medium and the soft with fuel in the car on Friday. So he had more information. Red Bull had more information than any other driver stroke team in the pit lane. And therefore they had more data on which to make a decision. And whether their data said, don't worry about it, late in the race, the soft tire is going to be the one to have, live with it on full tanks, live with the medium on full tanks, Max, I don't know. But it's possible, given the amount of data that they did accumulate. That wasn't just a gamble, I think. That was more Red Bull being as good as they are. Anyway, Max is on the medium. Everybody else is around him on the soft. And sure enough, because he's on the clean side of the grid in P5, he actually is in very good shape as they're coming into the braking area. He's picking up speed. He's getting the toe. But the problem he's got is two Ferraris, Lando in front. Then he's got the two Ferraris. And he's got George Russell muscling around as well. But the real problem he's got is that the Ferrari in the middle, moving to the left, starting to move to the left, is Charles Leclerc and not Lewis Hamilton. And I say that because of what we saw on the straight at the restart in the Spanish Grand Prix this year, when Charles had no compunction at all about basically driving into Max flat out in seventh gear. And it's all credit to Max. He just kept his foot in it and stayed there. And Charles, sure enough, did the predictable thing. He started to move over, obliging Max to get up on the curbs where it was bumpy and it was bottoming out. And he was on full load of fuel. But you got to give Max credit. I think he was genuinely trying to pull off the first 4-car pass into turn one that we've seen probably ever in the history of Formula One into the first corner. I think he had the momentum, and I don't know about those mediums, what it actually would have been like when he started to turn in. But you can see where he was coming from. You know, got to say, you know, when Max isn't right at the front, he always delivers something else, doesn't he? And yeah, he was in this one. He was left with no alternative really, but just to keep going straight on into the runoff area. And you thought, oh, race over, penalties. But actually, to their credit, the stewards didn't even investigate it because Max did a very good job at sort of filtering back. George Russell started bleating on the radio about, oh, Max gained position. He should get a penalty or give the position back. Yeah, he did that for Lewis. He was never going to do it for George Russell. And interestingly, the stewards agreed with that because there was no action taken there. And so Max filtered in behind Lewis, behind Charles, behind Lando, Charles, Lewis, who'd made a good start but had to give this position, made a very good start, went down the inside and might have been ahead of Charles Leclerc. But because of all that, all the argy-bargy, he lost the position to Charles. So I felt sorry for Lewis there, really. It wasn't really his fault that he did. But anyway, he was now in third and Max was in fourth with George Russell behind him. So that was the first thing. And I have to say, I was surprised that Charles Leclerc did not get a penalty at that point. He got away with it. And then not long after that, 4 or 5 laps after that, we had Max dive bombing Lewis into turn one on his mediums, which are now, I guess, had temperature in them and he had a reasonable amount of grip. But he dive bombs Lewis and he's going much too quickly and runs wide, runs into Lewis basically, and Lewis has to go left and off the track. And this is where actually the events unfolded immediately afterwards, affected the results of the race, because as they accelerated out of 3, there was no radio that I heard going to Max, but I think Max took it upon himself, he's in front of Lewis, to say to himself, I'll give the position back to Lewis. That for sure I'm going to get done there. I ran too quickly into one, you know, and Lewis obviously was saying, you know, what could I have done? I don't want to go too wide because there's not much grip on the outside. The marbles are terrible. And so as they go into turn 4, Max is, I think, saying to himself, I'm going to give the position back to Lewis. What he doesn't know is that Lewis is busy outbraking himself at this point, going to the outside of 4, running out of road and going into the grass. And Max, sort of slightly confused, is what it looks like to me with his body language, edges left all of a sudden and basically squeezes George, who then has to give room to Max, as a result of which Oliver Bearman and Kimi Antonelli get past. And that, you know, that's how Oliver Bearman got there. Track position. He obviously qualified top 10, as we said yesterday. Really, really good performance. And he made a good start as well. But how did he ever get in front of those Mercedes? He got in front there at exactly that moment when Max was sort of doing this sort of dummy or this ghost repass thing for Lewis, and it wasn't happening. And suddenly George was getting squeezed. And there's Oliver Bearman, opportunist that he is, going straight through down the middle. Absolutely fabulous bit of driving. Great to see. And his dad in the garage going ballistic. The whole thing was very well done in television wise and in terms of Oliver Bearman's driving as well. Bearman's driving. Anyway, as a result of all that, Lewis then got a 10-second penalty. And he got a 10-second penalty not because of any incident, but because when he rejoined, he didn't slow down to let the cars catch him behind, which is one of the things you have to do in the sporting code. And normally on the radio, the race engineer says to the driver, slow down, let them catch you up again. That didn't happen at Ferrari, and I think that's absolutely inexcusable. And I felt really, really sorry for Lewis that happened, because he drove really well in qualifying. He looked really good going into turn 1, and then the whole race just fell apart with that ridiculous 10-second penalty, which he then served in a pit stop. And I blame 100% the pit wall for that, for not telling Lewis what he should be doing in terms of the gap with the traffic when he's rejoining. And yeah, so that was not good at all. The other thing I'd go on to say is that I think Max should have got a penalty really for what he did to George at that point, because, George had to move massively to avoid Max. And Max didn't get a penalty. Okay, that was great for the race as it turned out, but I was surprised. I think Charles in the world of penalties in which we live, I was shocked that Charles didn't get a penalty for the turn one thing. And I was shocked that Max didn't get a penalty there. And the only guy that got the penalty was the guy that really didn't deserve it at all, and that was Lewis Hamilton. That's why I say, these circuits where you have so much runoff area and there's so much room to do all this stuff, that's where it becomes, well, unfair is the wrong word, because we have the stewards making the decision and they're looking according to all the rules. But when you take a 30,000-foot view of what happened, the one guy in all of that didn't deserve a penalty was Lewis Hamilton, and he's the only guy that got one. So that's a result of all this business of the circuits and the way they are. Then the next story for me was, well, there were two stories after that. We should go to Oscar Piastri now, who starts P8 in the other McLaren, leading the Drivers' World Championship. And I got to say, I'm absolutely staggered that they didn't start him on mediums as well. Why wouldn't they? They've got the surefire winner, they've got the pole, they've got the right tyres on which to start the race, to win the race in the quickest possible way, which is to start on the soft and go to the medium. We all knew that. And that's exactly what they did for Lando Norris, and it worked perfectly. But when you've got your other car, which is a brilliant racing car, which may get caught in the DRS train, why wouldn't you start it on mediums just to have some sort of difference there, to try to do something to break up the way he's going to be in traffic? And they didn't do it. And I wonder whether that is McLaren tightening up. Scared is the wrong word, but tightening up at this point of the year and not wanting to start the drivers on two different strategies, in case, heaven forbid, suddenly Oscar Piastri is right up there with Lando Norris, or even beating Lando Norris with a better strategy, with the softs coming into their own at the end of the race. So why didn't they do that? I guess it's because of that. And that's quite sad to see from Oscar's point of view. That's point one. Point two, Kimi Antonelli in that group that was now there. Kimi Antonelli was the first to stop, and he dropped sort of 2/3 of the way through the field. And then there were a whole bunch of pit stops from the soft to the medium. And that was led by Oliver Bearman. And Oscar Piastri was then called in as well to stop. And then the following lap, George Russell stopped. Again, I question that from McLaren. Okay, he was sitting in traffic. Maybe the tyres were not great. But he's in a McLaren, and he is Oscar Piastri. Why not leave him out to try and get some track position at that point? Because all that was ever going to happen, he was going to get back into the DRS train again, which is exactly what happened. Lap 22, you got Oliver Bearman, Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, and then Oscar Piastri. Lap 27, they've all made their pit stops. It's even worse now for Oscar, because you got Yuki Tsunoda, who also started on mediums, staying out there, now in track position ahead of Oliver Bearman, Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, and Oscar Piastri. To me, I mean, they made it much more difficult for Oscar than it needed to be. And I think in that car, if he'd started on mediums and gone to softs, he might have been on the podium. Probably would have been on the podium, actually. I'm sure he probably would have beaten Max. And I think that was a lost opportunity for McLaren there. The other thing was, well, a lost opportunity. Maybe they're very happy with it now, the way it is, the way it worked out. Maybe it's starting to look as if, yeah, all the momentum's behind Lando. I don't know what they're thinking, but maybe they're happy. Maybe that's what they intended. The next thing was Max on the medium tyre saying, they gave him lots of things to try, and he kept saying, nothing works. The car's terrible. It's sliding. I've got no grip. And he started to talk to them about, when to come in. And GP's radio, his race engineer, who's also head of racing engineering at Red Bull, he's got his radio open. Quite easy to do. It happens quite a lot. And I'm not sure it should have been put out publicly. I felt a bit bad that we're seeing that, because it was a mistake by the team, and immediately went out on worldwide global TV. I mean, I heard it a sort of lap before on the actual direct radio, but I guess, they just thought, oh, well, this is great, put it out. I just felt a bit sorry for him. Anyway, I thought it was a great catch by Max Verstappen after the race to say, oh, no, that wasn't to me. That was to do with Yuki. Because what we heard GP saying was, Max said, what do you want me to do when he was hearing about all the other runners coming in? Sorry, when he was hearing about guys like the Mercedes and Oliver Bearman coming in, what do you want me to do? Stay out or whatever? And we heard GP saying, what strategy on? 1 or 2 stop strategy. Which I suspect is fairly normal. I think the race engineer is running so many things that he is relying on the strategy department to basically keep him updated on what's going on. And I guess sometimes they probably forget. I mean, Mark Slade said that. I mean, sometimes they kind of forget to keep giving the information out, and you have to say to them, well, what have we decided to do? And I think that's what we heard. But then, great call by Max when he was asked by James Hinchcliffe after the race whether, why didn't they know what strategy they were on? Because they were still making up their mind. But he said, oh, no, that was Yuki's radio. A big mistake. No, don't worry about it. I don't think it was. I think it really was Max's radio. And so they did leave him out for a bit longer. And that, in many ways, made the race. I got to say, great strategy today from Red Bull. As bad as it's been in some races this year, like Singapore, like the Spanish Grand Prix, in my opinion, they got it absolutely spot on. Maybe it's all because of that homework they did uniquely before the race. But they kept him out longer on the medium than he was comfortable with, as long as they possibly could, waiting to find what they call the tyre delta, which is the moment when they think those on the medium tyre are going to start to lose a bit of grip, and when the soft tyre might still obviously be good enough for the full distance to remaining in the race. And they got it absolutely perfect. And that was good, because if they brought him in, say, 3-4 laps earlier, it might not have worked as well as it did. And the other point was when he got onto the soft tyres, Max was doing all he could to get them to give him higher modes on the engine, because he was doing so much tyre management in the first 4 or 5 laps on the soft tyre, looking after it in a way that I think other drivers probably can't even imagine. If you look at what happened with Lando Norris on his soft tyres in Austin, and how he abused them, really. The adrenaline was up, he was out of the pits, and he was on fire. He overused the softs, and it might have cost him the win, in fact. But here, Max was so restrained. I thought it was fabulous. He kept saying, oh, come on, give me a passing mode. No, Max, just stay with mode 6 for the moment. You're doing a great job with tyre management. Just keep looking after the tyres. And Max said, yeah, all I'm doing is conserving the tyres. And although at that point he was catching guys like Leclerc, he was already catching him 3 or 4 tenths a lap, even though he was in tyre conservation mode. And he did such a good job. He brought the red tyres, the soft tyres in perfectly, so that when they got to their tyre delta, he could then start to go. And he did. It was just a fabulous drive. It's a shame that they didn't just have the onboard of Max Verstappen at that point, because the way he was driving and how good he was through Sector 2, which is mainly the high-speed S's, because the car was still jinking around, and we was really having to work for it to get it absolutely perfect. But every lap, remorselessly, it was 2 or 3 tenths on Charles Leclerc. And then there's that lovely moment when you can actually see the car in front that you've been catching all this time. I remember Pete Lyons, the great American journalist, writing that once. I think it was a Denny Hulme, Emerson Fittipaldi thing. I think. I'm pretty vague about that. But I remember him saying, and then on lap 47, he could see the rear wing of the Lotus. And I just thought, wow, and it was the same thing, and GP made the point to Max, there's your man, go for it, this is an epic stint. And Max could see it. And of course, all that ended in massive anticlimax. Or you could put the other way, it ended correctly from the point of view of Charles Leclerc and Ferrari, because as the whole world knows, virtual safety car. Well, first of all, yellows came out for a lap, 2 laps before the virtual safety car was deployed or activated, right at the end of the race, just as Max was in DRS range of Charles, and just as he surely would have passed him and got second place on the last lap probably. The virtual safety car came out and he had to cruise around and finish third behind Charles. But here I got to say, I did say earlier Charles should have got that penalty, but putting that to one side, the lap before the yellows came out, which is the third last lap of the race, when Max is now right on him, Charles' pin-sharp braking at the end of the main straight into turn 1 was absolutely magnificent. No other word to describe it. Just perfect. The tyres had gone. The Ferrari was terrible on the mediums for whatever reason. And Mexico had all these for whatever reasons, didn't they? Why was Max so slow in qualifying? He was good on the softs in the back end of the race. But in this moment, with Max right behind him, and he's just in a natural tow, it wasn't a DRS at this point, but he's catching him under braking. Charles is just perfect in the way he stops the Ferrari. And this Max tries to go right and just couldn't do it. that was just one of the great bits of great bits of driving we saw today in Mexico. Max too, absolutely outstanding. I've said before, sometimes it's great to watch these great drivers in races when they're not in the best car, winning, pulling away, because you see them having to work and be creative with all these things. And to see Charles have to drive that well on the mediums at that point was just sublime. So, yeah, those two finished like that. And then, of course, there was Oliver Bearman and Oscar Piastri. Oscar was catching him and may have got him. Oscar eventually got past the two Mercs, but he didn't. And virtual safety car conditions, Oliver Bearman finished P4 in the Mexican Grand Prix in a Haas Ferrari. New floor in Austin, which is working well. So it's good to see all these teams, patronising to say it, but good to see, better late than never, I guess, how all these teams are starting to catch up now and finding these secrets that have been so elusive for the last 2 years. Adrian had them all initially, now McLaren, and now everybody else is starting to find them. Red Bull almost. Haas Ferrari, Racing Bulls have been pretty good, haven't they, as well? But the Haas Ferrari today, a lot of it was track position with Oliver, getting that track position, but being aggressive enough and having the ability to see gaps and go for it the way he did. And being, what can I say, confident enough to just blow past George Russell and Kimi Antonelli and beat the Mercs. There was a bit of a kerfuffle too between the Merc drivers, quite entertaining television, of George behind Kimi Antonelli, who's trying to get past Oliver Bearman, and Oscar Piastri, obviously, sitting right on George's tail. And George, concerned, because he's using his tyres, A, sitting too closely to Antonelli, and B, having to defend against Oscar Piastri, who's really quick. So George gets on the radio to say, I've got the pace, let me swap positions. If it doesn't work, let's see what happens. I'll give it back position back at the end of the race. And they said, well, you're free to overtake, George, which was one of these classic moments, really, which obviously didn't go down too well with George. It reminds me of Colin Chapman one year at Monaco. I only heard this. I didn't see it. I kind of saw it in the distance, but I heard later what was actually said. I was talking to Ken Tyrrell about it. Colin, it was when Ronnie Peterson was going really well in the Lotus 72, and he was behind a Tyrrell for about 3 laps. And Colin walked down to the Tyrrell pit to speak to Ken Tyrrell to say, tell your driver to let my driver pass. And Ken said, well, tell your driver to overtake. It's a little bit like that. And then George gets on the radio and says, I've got a McLaren behind. Do you want me to let him pass? Yeah, all this going on. I think, it's been going on for a long time, all this business in the team. But, when it's Kimi Antonelli and it's George Russell, George is the clear number one undisputed driver, in my opinion. And Kimi Antonelli's the young rookie who, he's part of the Mercedes fabric, I guess. But if you translate that to Max Verstappen and Yuki Tsunoda, do you think Max would ask permission on the radio to pass Yuki Tsunoda? It'd just be boom, out of my way, bud. And so I'm surprised that George did that, really. It gives an insight into the team, the happy, glad, happy family at Mercedes, a bit like the McLaren one. Oh no, we better not put Oscar on a different tyre strategy. It might upset one of the two drivers. And so, we saw a bit of that too. I think they missed an opportunity. They could probably have done more if they'd let George through earlier, or if George had passed earlier, I suppose. But, could he have done it, really? I suppose George was thinking, actually, to pass this guy, I've got to take a few risks, and we don't want to hit one another. So I'd rather they told him to, move over. I guess it was that, really. George just thinking of the team more than anything else. But Mercedes, a bit disappointing. But then again, you've got to say the medium tyre, actually, in the back end of the race, for any that were on it, was a disappointing tyre to be on, which meant that around lap 48, lap 50, if you were on the medium, you then wanted to get back to the soft again as part of your two-stop strategy, unless, of course, you were Lando Norris at the front of the race with Charles Leclerc also in P2, and you stayed out on your mediums. And, of course, that is what gave Max the track position to be P3. He was the first of the soft runners by then, finishing in third place. But interestingly, by the end of the race, Max had done 34 laps on the softs compared with, say, Oscar Piastri, 24 laps on the softs. So not a lot more. And that speaks to the strength of the Red Bull strategy today and how long Max was able to run those mediums when he had zero grip. And I wonder, I'm trying to work out really how that worked out for Pirelli. You could argue on one side of the coin, what was the hard tyre all about? Because it was barely seen and nobody went near it. So what was the point of it? And then the whole thing was to have the medium and the soft very close to one another. But the soft was a better tyre than the medium. And so that was odd. But on the other side of the coin, we wouldn't have had this amazing race between Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen if we didn't have these two compounds. We didn't have this rule of having to run two different compounds in the race. In that sense, it was a brilliant day for Pirelli. And so, yeah, obviously jury out on the whole Pirelli thing. But I have to say, it's not an easy job doing what Pirelli do. And I think they will get a lot of criticism probably for the way the medium performed. But for me, what would be better? Bernie selling everybody Avon tyres and no Pirelli in Formula One, which is what it would have been if we hadn't let Pirelli have the monopoly into Formula One. So anyway, that was just a bit of background on that. So let's just go through the final results just to see if I've covered all bases. Lando Norris won that race by 30 seconds. Just amazing weekend for him from beginning to end. Just superb. And for McLaren too. Congratulations to them. Charles Leclerc finished second, just ahead of Max Verstappen. Max probably would have got him. We'll never really know, but I think he would have with DRS. But because of the virtual safety car, he didn't. An unbelievable climb back, though. Just superb by Max Verstappen and by Charles Leclerc as well. Oliver Bearman, an amazing fourth. Oscar Piastri, fifth in the McLaren-Mercedes. If he had run the different strategy, would have done better, I think. Kimi Antonelli, George Russell. In the end, George gave the position back to Kimi. Kimi actually got on the radio to say, are we going to reverse positions now? I was surprised he did that, because the dignified thing, in my opinion, would have been to let Mercedes tell George to do that and not for Kimi to look as if sixth place meant so much to him. Because, P6, factory Mercedes driver, does it really matter? Anyway, Kimi Antonelli, P6, George, P7, not a great result. Lewis Hamilton, felt very sorry for him, P8, should have got a much better result than that with that ridiculous penalty. Well, the penalty, I'm sure, was correctly applied, but Ferrari should never have allowed that to happen, and he didn't deserve any penalty at all for the way he drove. Esteban Ocon, underlining the speed of the Haas Ferrari, finished ninth. So what a day for Haas. P4, P9 in Mexico. And Gabriel Bortoleto had some great passes, really good, particularly on Yuki Tsunoda and also on Isaac Hadjar. Drove very well in the Sauber Ferrari to finish P10 ahead of said Yuki. And Alex Albon, who seemed to be massively annoyed throughout the race about the setup of the car, strategy, whatever. Isaac Hadjar, Lance Stroll, Pierre Gasly, Colapinto, and so there we go. An amazing race and a great race. Astonishing win for Lando Norris, and what a battle for second place. Unfortunately, I never actually got to see what the debris was in, what was it, turn 18, 19, that brought out the yellows and the virtual safety car. I wonder if there really was any. Oh no, that's been conspiracy, isn't it? No, it was probably something Ferrari. Some Ferrari fan probably dropped a T-shirt or something on the track there. Oh, shouldn't be saying that. Big thanks, as I say, to RSC Watches, to Jetcraft, to Track Ninja, and to OEM Exclusive for their support. For you, the viewer, for staying with it. Late nights here in Europe. But we'll be back with plenty of live streams, chats with Cam, Mark Slade, maybe even some scarbs as well in the very near future. So don't go away. Thanks for watching. See you soon.